All right, thanks everybody for coming today. I'm really glad to be sharing this day of celebration of the earth with you all, and I hope that this talk will inspire you to save seeds if you're not already, or just get you more excited about the coming season to save some more seeds. My name is Pete Rundlet. I was born in the east coast of the United States in a little state called Rhode Island. I've had the pleasure and privilege of being a commercial and not so commercial farmer for the past 15 years. I got my start in CSA agriculture, growing on about 7 acres with vegetables and providing vegetables for the community. And after I got into farming, I became really passionate about social activism in farming and started thinking a lot about seeds as a form of social activism. Not just the seeds themselves, but the entire act of farming, and to establish a direct connection with our food, to claim our food sovereignty as growers, and to be, I want to say independent, but that word sovereignty, to have control over our food supply, to not lose control to outside interests who might have profit as their first priority. So for me, saving seed is all about really establishing a direct connection with the plants that I'm growing and interacting with them on a day-to-day basis, and then allowing the full cycle of that plant to continue within my garden. So I'm not separating the production of seed or the production of seedlings ideally from my garden. I like to start all my own seeds if I can, and save seeds if at all possible, so that I can start to establish an adapted strain for my garden. So I'm going to talk about just my passion for seeds and also introduce some basic concepts around seed saving today. So first, I just wanted to say, what is a seed? A seed is an embryo of a plant that is created by the combination of pollen, the male sex part or the male sex contribution, and the egg or the ovule, or I'm not too up on all the terms, but yeah, it's the male and the female coming together to create an offspring. And I think it's really cool that that's an embryo. It's not a fully formed, mature being yet. And that embryo is produced freely in our atmosphere. It doesn't have the protection of a womb like us mammals do. And then the embryo falls to the earth and implants itself into the womb of the earth. So I just want to start with that because that's something that I've really thinking about and really makes me just have a wonder in the sense of the seed. So seeds are the product of pollination. As I said, it's the male pollen combining with the female flower to create an embryo. So pollination happens by a few different mechanisms. One is wind, where wind will come and blow pollen from the flower onto the female parts. Corn is a great example of that. The male tassel at the top shakes in the air and the pollen drops down to the female silks and adjacent plants. So that's wind pollination. There's also what I would call biological pollination, which would be an outside agent such as a butterfly or a bee or a hummingbird coming in to bring out the pollination. And then there's self-pollinated plants. And those are plants that the pollination happens right within the flower. They have a flower that has male and female parts, and nothing has to happen. The pollen falls directly from its own male parts onto its own female parts, and one plant can produce its own seed. And that's true for other ones that aren't necessarily self-pollinating, but we won't go too much into that detail. So there's the pollination method. It's useful to know what your pollination mechanism is when you're saving seed, because you want to know, for instance, if it's insect pollinated. In the case of a cucumber or squash, you want to make sure that bees have access to it, that pollinators have access to it. So putting a cucumber in a closed greenhouse might limit your pollination and fruit set. So that's one thing to consider, the pollination mechanisms. And seed saving is really simple. Anybody can do it. And those self-pollinated ones that I mentioned make it so that you can go out and just pick a tomato, that's a self-pollinated crop, or harvest a lettuce plant that's gone to seed. Those are also self-pollinated. And harvest the seed, and more than likely you're going to have a offspring that resembles what you started out with, and And it's really easy, really simple. Anybody can do it with a very small garden. Just one tomato plant is all you need to save seed from tomatoes. Home gardeners also have a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of technical terms in seed saving that when I first started, it got me kind of discouraged, but like, oh, I need to make sure I have enough population size, which is very important, but you can play around with that a little bit. And you need to make sure that things don't cross. But actually, I came to find that I really love things crossing because you get totally new varieties out of that. You get a happy accident where maybe your yellow cucumber crosses with your green cucumber and you get something that's in between and you really like it. So that's how all new varieties are created, is through crossing either accidentally or intentionally. And by allowing that to happen naturally in your garden, you're creating the potential for that to happen without your guidance, and these happy accidents, these surprises will come to you, and you can eat them and decide if you like them and keep perpetuating that one plant, or you can say, no, that thing tastes terrible. I'm going to get rid of it. I'm pulling it out before it contributes any more pollen to my garden. So that's some, those are things to think about. Selection is another part of the process, like I just mentioned. If you find something that doesn't taste good, or it's not performing in your garden, it's not performing under your management practices, then you might not want to save seed from that. It might have produced a little bit of food, so you're going to eat that food, but it's not going to be the parent for your next seed crop. The selection process can be complicated and it can be really simple. All you really need to do, though, is just observe and look and see what you want and take out the unwanted individuals and try to prevent them from pollinating your other plants. Seed storage is also a really important aspect of it. Seeds are ideally kept in cool, dry conditions, so you want to make sure that they have those conditions available to them, or else they're going to start to want to germinate if they're moist, or in general they just start to die without, if they're in hot and wet conditions. So basically, seed saving is just really fun. It's really easy. Anybody can do it. Just go out there and play. That's what I started doing, and I realized that a lot of things that I was cautioned against were not too big, like those cross-pollination issues. If I saved seeds from 2 cucumber plants next to each other, and the concern of cross-pollination was big, or I was concerned about cross-pollination, what I saw was that there wasn't really that much. I would get mostly all the same things that I started with, in a few maybe different ones, or in a lot of cases, none at all. I thought that I was going to get accidental crosses and nothing happened. It was just, I guess the bees decided to visit this patch first and then this patch next. So yeah, I think that saving seed is just a wonderful process to engage in, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and go out and have fun this season. Don't be afraid. The seeds want you to take care of them, they want you to interact with them, and all you have to do is just start doing it. Okay.
Why is it important for us to save the seeds?
It's really important to save seeds because, for me, it's to develop that direct connection. There are, activism, the political aspects of it. Saving seeds creates our own food sovereignty and our independence from, multinational conglomerates that are now trying to take control of not only our seed supply, but the genetic basis for our seed supply. That's really important. It's also really important to save seeds to adapt your varieties to your own garden, so that you're not always relying on some outside source. If you bring in seeds from another source, a lot of times they won't do too well in your garden, and another gardener saying, they're doing great in my garden. So what I found is that really the seeds need to adapt to your soil, to your management practice, and even your presence. I mean, there's a direct communication between all organisms, so they're going to get to know you and respond to you in your what you ask of it, really. Any other questions?
I would like a little technical.
Okay. Okay. Technical in general, just going into more depth. Okay. One thing I forgot to mention is seed processing. There's wet processed seeds and dry processed seeds. Those are the main categories. So wet processed would be anything that's encased in a wet fruit, like a tomato, a melon, a cucumber, a squash, a pepper. And a dry processed seed would be something that is dried on the plant, either in a pod or in a cluster, but you want to wait till the seed is fully dry and you're actually shaking the seed from the plant, or threshing it in that case. So like a bean pod, you would crush and separate the pods from the seed. And with a wet processed seed, you actually have to crush the fruit and either wash away the pulp or ferment the pulp a little bit to be able to wash it away. Tomatoes are a really good example of that. If you look at a tomato seed, you're familiar with that little gelatinous goo that's around the seed. If you try to just take one of those seeds and dry it, it's going to stick to whatever you put it on. And that gelatinous goo is actually also including some germination inhibitors that you need to break down. So by fermenting your tomatoes, you're breaking down that protective covering, and then you can wash it away once it's started to break down. So that's one that really needs to be wet processed. What I found recently is that things that I thought needed to be wet processed and I had read were meant for that actually do really well. Well, they are meant for wet processing, but you don't need to ferment them, is what I mean to say. Like a winter squash, for example. I'd always fermented my winter squash seeds, and then this past year I did some experiments with fermenting and not fermenting, and it turned out the ones that I just washed the pulp away without fermenting actually germinated better in the end.
I had not heard of fermenting seeds before in this kind of for saving.
Yeah, cucumbers are another good example. You know, anything that has that kind of goo around it, especially, I think needs to be fermented.
So what do you use to ferment?
So you take the fruit, you crush it up and put it in a container. As long as all the seeds are covered in the juice of the fruit, that's all you need to do. You ferment it for 2-3 days. 3 days I think is probably the ideal, until you start to see a little bit of bubbling or just that you know it's fermented. And then you go through a decanting process where you add water to your pulp and swish it around, and all of the pulp and non-viable seeds will be less dense and float in the mixture. And you pour off that pulp, and the viable seeds will stay at the bottom. So you just got to be careful. You pour off the pulp and keep the viable seeds at the bottom of the jar or container, wherever you have. And then you just keep decanting, keep removing debris through that process until the seed is totally clean in the water. You see nothing but clean water and seeds, and then strain it and dry it. So that's basically how you would do a tomato or a melon or a cucumber. People do peppers that way, but I've also done peppers where you just cut the pepper in half and take the seeds out and dry it. So that means that you can actually eat your pepper flesh and save your seeds too, which is nice. Some wet processed seeds, the fruit is fully ripe when you're harvesting the seed. For example, a tomato, they're all fully ripe when you're harvesting the seed. A tomato is ripe and ready to eat when the seed is ripe. A cucumber, we're actually eating the immature fruit. So to mature a cucumber seed, you need to allow the fruit to go past the point where you'd want to eat it, where the skin starts getting really thick and the seeds start getting really hard. So it's important to know at what point the fruit is actually ripe. So with tomatoes, peppers, where you're harvesting the ripe fruit when the fruit is full color. Eggplant, on the other hand, is actually not fully mature until it goes a little bit tougher than you would want to eat it. And then cucumbers, again, an immature fruit. Squashes, zucchinis, like the summer squash zucchinis are immature fruit, but a mature winter squash is a fully mature fruit where you can scoop out the seeds, save seeds, and also eat the fruit. So those are things that I really like, where you can have your seeds and eat the fruit. Any other questions about that?
Do you ever soak them and sprout them right before planting?
I do. I sometimes sprout them and then put them in the ground for planting, and I also do germination tests. Those are two different ideas. So I'll even sprout some seeds a few weeks before I want to plant them to make sure that they're going to be viable before I invest the space and time in planting them in my garden. And often what I've been doing with that is I'll sprout a little bit of seeds in advance to see if they're good. And then if they do sprout, I go and put them in the garden just to see if they're going to grow. And so that's kind of what I would call like my Hail Mary early planting. Like I planted cucumbers in the ground in Northern California, where I live right now, in mid-March. And it's still pretty cold and it gets pretty wet, but I had sprouted seeds and I just put a few out there, and I went back later and keep putting more seeds in. So another process that I really like to engage in is just putting a lot of seeds out there. And as a home seed saver, you have an advantage that you can save a lot of seeds. You're not limited by buying a little packet and the financial aspect of like not wanting to invest in a lot of seed. So like when I first started saving winter squash seeds, I saved a ton of seed, way more than I thought I could ever use. But then what I did was I took all the seed I had, or a lot of it because I had so much, and I sowed a really thick row of winter squash so that they were spaced like this close together. And then when they all came up, then I went down the row and I selected the ones that looked the most vigorous, the most healthy. And in doing that, you're engaging in that selection process, you're improving the variety, and you're also going to get the most vigorous individuals for that season. So I found when I've done that, I get really good results, I get high yields, and I've eliminated a lot of the weaker genetics in my gene pool in doing that. As opposed to if you have a little bit of seed that's been grown in a large scale on a commercial farm, most commercially grown seed you'll find is pales in comparison to your homegrown seed. So you have a little bit of seed, and they haven't, they've done selection before that, but then when they grow the seed out, they just harvest in mass. They're not selecting their seed for sale. So you're getting the weak individuals of that crop and the strong individuals of that crop. As a home gardener, you can constantly select the best seed. And so I found when I started saving seed, I had phenomenal results, better than I ever had with seeds I had bought. It totally changed the game for my productivity in my garden.
So when you first, somebody else had a question?
Yeah.
When you first start, would you start with going out to the farmer's market and getting the best organic food you can find, or how do you, rather than buying packets?
Well, I mean, I started buying seeds. That was definitely the basis for a lot of my seed acquisition. Also from other seed savers, there's Seed Savers Exchange, and better, I think, are more informal gatherings where people just get together and share their own seeds. But you could also go out and buy a fruit of something that's ripe to get seed from it. But that's going to be pretty limited. Like you get a tomato or a winter squash and save seed from it. But you're not going to get lettuce seed at the farmer's market, for instance. So for lettuce, you're only eating the vegetative part of the plant, and you'll never see the seed unless you actually let it go past that. I kind of lost my train of thought there, but you could start with that. But what I want to say is you also want to make sure that it's an open pollinated variety, or find out what it is at least, because if it's a hybrid, then you're going to get a wide range of traits coming out of that, which isn't necessarily bad. If it's a hybrid variety that you really like, you can save seed from it and attempt to stabilize it as an open pollinated variety. And now that I'm throwing those ideas out there, I should probably discuss what open pollinated and hybrid are. So open pollinated plants are plants that have been allowed to perform their sexual reproduction freely amongst themselves. There's not human intervention where we're going out and taking a male flower and mating it with a female flower directly. So open pollinated is just natural. Let the plants do their thing in the garden. Hybridization takes different forms. There are like the commercially available hybrids where commercial seed producers are inbreeding two parent lines. They're eliminating most of the genetic diversity in their two parent lines so that when they cross them, they get really predictable results from that cross. So that's one example of a hybrid. All those hybrids you see in seed catalogs that say F1 hybrid. But another example of an F1 hybrid could be your yellow crookneck summer squash crossing with your Costata romanesco zucchini. So any cross between two distant but related plants, or not, I shouldn't say distant, but two different expressions of the same species is a new hybrid. So you could hybridize sweet pepper and a hot pepper to get something in between. And so you can create your own hybrids in your garden that aren't necessarily of the same nature as the commercially available F1 hybrids. F1 just means familial one, so it's the first generation after the cross. So a lot of people will talk about second generation, F2, F3, how it looks multiple generations out. And I have friends who are doing this kind of work. Some people call it dehybridization, but I think a better term would be just stabilizing a hybrid variety into an open pollinated variety. So a good example is I have a friend who's working with this thing that was a hybrid winter squash, and he's been planting it for a number of seasons to the point where now it's pretty much the same as the hybrid that he started with. There's still some variability in it, but all the squash, or most of the squash that we get is absolutely sweet and delicious, and some of it is maybe not totally sweet, but none of it's bad. It's all edible. So you can eat your mistakes in home gardening and seed farming.
What do you think of Monsanto that wants to control the seed
My personal thoughts on Monsanto, I think that they are.
Say it.
I really don't like them. I don't like their agenda in the world. They're basically set on trying to control the genetic resources of the planet, of not just our vegetable crops at this point, but also pretty much everything. They're also monopolizing the pesticide and fertilizer industries. I'm not sure about the fertilizer, but I know the pesticide industries. So they're selling crops that are adapted to function with their pesticides. And it's just like a package deal. You know, Roundup Ready soybean is a perfect example. They sell you a soybean that you can spray Roundup on, something that they produce, and it kills everything else in your field except for the soybean. And so, meanwhile, people are eating soybeans that are contaminated with Roundup, which seems really scary to me. So, yeah, I really don't like Monsanto.
So
I hope they think better of themselves soon. But I don't buy from stores. I buy only from seed companies that participate in the Safe Seed Pledge. So that means that they pledge not to sell any GMO
yeah.
crops. They test their seeds for GMO contamination.
Okay.
It should be said that Monsanto also owns a lot of the open pollinated seed companies nowadays, or a lot of open pollinated seed supply. They've bought out most of the large seed suppliers in the world at this point. If you want to find reliable seed companies, I know there are a number of them out there, but I know one that I really think highly of is Fedco Seeds in Maine. I know they're way up there, but they get seeds from all over the world actually and sell them. Maine, Fedco, like federal, Fedco. So they're a cooperatively owned seed business, and not only have they taken the Safe Seed Pledge, they polled their customer base a number of years back and asked if their customers wanted them to carry seeds that were produced by Monsanto-owned subsidiaries. And the customer base replied no. So every seed in Fedco's catalog is produced by a company that is not owned by Monsanto, has no GMOs. That's one company. I'll just stick with that one. I like them a lot. They've done me well. You know, they're really committed to preserving our plant genetic diversity. Did you have a question, Francesca?
Yeah, I was kind of curious about, in general, population sizes.
Okay.
So, like, either on average or, like you mentioned, tomatoes, since they're self-pollinating,
Yeah.
you can take the seeds from one fruit,
Yeah.
and that would be okay, but are there others that you would recommend really planting more or a minimum number of, or is it okay, you know,
Yeah.
if I have a small space and just want to plant, like, one or two plants of each variety or each type of,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah, population size really is important, and ideally you want high population sizes for everything that you're growing. The more diversity you have, the better. So planting out more individuals is optimal, but it's not always feasible for an individual home gardener who has, you know, just space for one tomato plant and one pepper plant. So those are examples where you can save seed from one plant, and it would be better to have more, but you can do it, and I think it'll probably be reliable for, I'm not sure for how long, honestly, but before that genetic bottlenecking, that limiting of the genetic diversity starts to manifest in inbreeding. So those self-pollinated plants are not as susceptible to that. There are some that are really susceptible to inbreeding. The entire Brassica family, which is a pretty big family in our crop schemes, they need high population sizes. Ideally, at least 120 plants. So that means like the home gardener is going to have a hard time saving seeds from broccoli, for instance, unless you have a big patch of broccoli. But there are ways to do it. Like kale is another example of a brassica. And you can grow a really big kale plant, and you can have just 2 in your garden, or you can grow a thick row and have 120 individuals in a short space like this. They won't get to be full size, but they'll all get to contribute their bit to the genetic gene pool. So that's, you know, by having more smaller plants is one way to do it, but that's harder to do with something like a broccoli. A kale, you can have baby kale. You don't necessarily want little tiny broccoli plants because you're going to get maybe little tiny buds like this, but maybe that's one way to do it. So brassicas are one that I'm really aware of is susceptible to inbreeding depression. Nothing else is really jumping out at me. Like an example of something that's kind of in between would be the cucurbits. And those would be like squashes, cucumbers, melons, and they have imperfect flowers. So that means that the flowers are either male or female, as opposed to a perfect flower, which contains both the male and the female parts. So generally, cucurbids prefer to be cross-pollinators. They're not self-pollinated. They're pollinated by insects, so they want to contribute their pollen to another individual nearby, not to themselves. But they can. You can have one squash plant set seed from its own male flower to its female flower, or so I've read. I haven't actually tried it. Because I really, some winter squash, every time I've ever had the chance to grow it, I've grown a lot of it. I've had the privilege of having access to land and managing systems that were minimum an acre most of the time. So that gives you enough space to have population sizes for pretty much everything if you want to save seed. And then there's the aspect of climate too, and you won't always be able to save seed. That's not related to the population size, but broccoli seed, for instance, is pretty tricky to grow. It doesn't set seed at temperatures over 90 degrees, but it flowers in the early summer when the temperatures are typically higher than that. So most of the brassica seeds are grown in places that have cool summers, like on the coast of California or maybe in the mountains somewhere. But yeah, population size is quite important, but there is leeway, and there are varieties out there of melon, for instance, that originated from one individual that somebody saved and has now spawned a whole variety called Blacktail Mountain melon, for example. Blacktail Mountain. So yeah, one person was growing a melon at their place in Montana where it's really hard to grow watermelons. And he planted out a whole bunch of watermelon seeds, and one plant matured one fruit that year, and he saved seed from it. And that is the basis for the entire Blacktail Mountain watermelon variety. So that's something that you can do. That's adaptation right there. It's like you could put out 100 seeds of something, and if one plant produces a seed, that plant probably has some genetics in it that means that it's going to have more adapted offspring. Evan, in his talk earlier, gave a perfect example of that with the chia blanco from the Sierra Madre that was grown here and only matured a pinch of seeds the first year and then was frozen, and then the offspring from that pinch of seeds, he said, matured 10 days earlier than the previous year. So by doing that, selecting for the earliest one if you want early, or the reddest one if you want red, then you can guide your varieties towards what you want, which I think is a really fascinating process, because it doesn't seem like we really fully understand genetics at this point and how that adaptation process works. Because somewhere within that plant, those genes are coming out, and the question is it a recessive gene, or are there mutations happening that the plant is actually responding to its environmental stimulus? And the classic, I think, idea is that the plant relies entirely on its genetic code, what's available within its genetic code, and maybe there are just things that are really hidden in there. But I really wonder about how much organisms actually receive information and adapt to their environment. Yeah, does anybody else have any questions? I love answering questions. It makes it a lot easier. Danielle.
I wondered, do you ever hand pollinate anything? And if you could maybe give an example of what you would hand pollinate if you do, and what do you stand to lose or gain from hand pollinating things?
I'm trying to think I don't think I've ever hand pollinated anything. I'm very much an OP kind of guy. Let things do it on their own. I've heard stories that, for example, if you hand pollinate winter squash, you're going to get better seed set. But I've never had trouble with seed set in winter squash, and I don't know, it doesn't seem like it would be worth my time to go out and pick the male flower early in the morning and bring it over there. You have to get out there really early before the flower opens, or you have to close it up the night before. You have to get there before the bees start to fly. So I really prefer not to hand pollinate, because as we were talking about, you're adapting your crops to your management technique. So if you start to hand pollinate everything, then you might wind up with a variety that needs hand pollination. Or if you irrigate everything really heavily, then you're going to be adapting all of your strains to be relying on a lot of water. So, a good quote that I heard recently is by this guy, Mark Shepard. His book is called Regenerative Agriculture. restoration agriculture. Excuse me. And the quote was, if you design for anything less than paradise, that's what you're going to get. So garden in the way that you really want to garden, and then you can adapt crops to the way that you garden, rather than yielding to the predominant idea that you have to spray it, or you have to do this to it, or you have to do that to it. If you stop doing those things to it, you might find that one individual, just like that melon I mentioned earlier, thrives and can be the genetic basis for your strain that doesn't need that spray or doesn't need that protection at that time of year. So I'm really thinking more and more about just no fuss, like put the seeds out there, let them do their thing, create, there's still a relationship there where I am cultivating the earth and creating the conditions for these crops that seem to prefer cultivated earth to thrive, and then putting them there and then letting them kind of function in a more natural way. But that being said, that's another example. It's like I'm tilling and I'm putting the plants into a tilled situation, so I'm adapting them to a tilled garden. Maybe I could adapt them to a non-tilled garden if I just put them in non-tilled soil. It does seem like there's kind of a threshold that I haven't been able to pass, where it's like if you have a grassy lawn, you can't just throw a bunch of kale seeds out there and get kale. Grasses are pretty competitive. They actually emit enzymes that prevent other plants from growing. So they do. Most of the plants that we work with are what might be called band-aid species or pioneer species, meaning that they're coming to heal the wounds of the earth. And we've adapted them to become a more delicious and tender vegetable for ourselves. But most of them started out as what would be like primary succession vegetables, like most of the weeds that have co-evolved with them. So all the plants that grow in your garden, the weeds and the vegetables alike, they're all adapted to tillage agriculture. This young man over here.
What about saving seeds from hybrids?
So yeah, we talked about that a little bit. So that would be like what people call, or what do you mean by saving seeds from hybrids?
Like, is it okay to save seeds from hybrids? Is it?
You can save seeds from hybrids.
If I buy a hybrid seed packet, or if I have a hybrid seed packet around and I like it, is it?
You can save seed from hybrids. You're just not sure what you're going to get. As I said, most of the commercially available hybrid varieties are the result of two inbred parent lines. So those cross to create a new individual that expresses hybrid vigor, but if either one of those parents could be really weak and would not produce a crop that you would want. So one might just only infer disease protection, the other one infers yield, but the yield one has no disease protection, and the disease protection one just tastes terrible, but they both combine to make a high-yielding, disease-resistant strain. Yes?
So unless it says heirloom in a catalog, it's going to be hybrid?
Not necessarily heirloom. Heirloom is a term for open pollinated. So open pollinated meaning the plants just had sex on their own in the field, nobody intervened.
Okay.
And an heirloom is an older variety of open pollinated. So you can create your own open pollinated variety now, and then the older open pollinated varieties we started to call heirlooms. So there might be a technical definition like 25 or 50 years or older, I'm not sure what, but it just means an old open pollinated variety. And then, an F1 hybrid as sold in the catalogs is, as I was saying, that combination usually of two inbred parent lines. Not necessarily always though. If you start to save seeds from hybrids, you might find that some of the strains that people are selling as hybrids in seed catalogs are actually pretty stable. They've been stabilized as open pollinated varieties, or they just don't have the tendencies of some hybrids, and maybe they started with a hybrid and maybe they even stabilized it, the seed company I'm talking about. But for some reason they're still selling it as a hybrid. And most of that has to do with the concept of like intellectual property rights, and because seed breeders really guard their parent lines and their hybrid lines. So if they still market it as a hybrid, they're giving the home gardener the impression that they can't save seed from it, even though it might be possible. So there are some like tomato varieties out there that I know folks that are marketed as hybrids. They save seed and it's just the same as what they had, and it just keeps going that way. So there's a lot of marketing out there. You have to be careful, and that's same thing with like all the technical stuff about be careful about this and be careful about that. It's like you can easily just back yourself into a corner and be like, all right, I'm just going to let the professionals do it. I can't save seeds, but really, like I'm trying to say, it's really easy, it's really simple, and you can play around. And especially if you're a home gardener and you're not relying on that for your livelihood, why not just have fun in your garden? Because by investing that time now, you're going to be creating a longer term relationship with the crops that you're working with. So maybe you get something you don't want one year, and you have a tomato plant that just is producing really insipid, bland tomatoes. Oh well, sorry, you know, to the compost pile. Yeah, hopefully you have room for more than one tomato plant.
So I have one more question. So I started saving seeds from like heirloom foods,
Mm-hmm.
but then I didn't have a garden to put them in.
Mm-hmm.
I know corn and things can be viable for thousands of years, but what about things like tomatoes?
All seeds have their own defined shelf life. You can find like tables of this available online. Tomatoes are an example of a very long-lived seed. I've been germinating seed this spring that's 9 to 10 years old that I saved. I try to keep my seeds in really good storage conditions. So as I was saying, cool, dry. I store them in canning jars, or I just recently bought an airtight stainless steel canister that I keep them in. I bought these little beads. They're silica beads that absorb moisture, and they're reusable, so they turn from blue when they're dry to red when they're wet, and then I just take them out of the container and I dry them in the oven and I put them back in, so that keeps the moisture low. You could potentially pull too much moisture out of your seeds if you just kept doing that, but I find that a little bit of moisture somehow always gets into my containers, and it's good to have that buffer there of a desiccant in there. I mean, that's like taking a lot of steps, and I like to do that because I'm really fanatical about my seeds, I guess, and want them to last as long as possible. So I'm finding that, like, 10-year-old tomato seeds are germinating almost 100% for me. My cucumber seeds that I saved in 2007 are starting to die this year, but I had really good results with them for a long time. So with good storage conditions, you can keep your seeds for a long time. One thing that I like to be really cautious about is like not taking them out of their storage conditions when the conditions are really moist in the atmosphere, especially if you're keeping them in a cool environment, because if you take them out of your cold basement in the middle of the monsoons and bring them upstairs, then all the humidity in the air is going to want to condense on your seeds. So what I usually do is I take the container out of the cold storage, I bring it to the warm area so that the seeds can warm to the ambient temperature before I expose them to the atmosphere and have the opportunity for moisture to condense in the packets and whatnot.
Lettuce seeds.
Yeah.
They go to flower, the bolts go to flower. Is it after they flower that you can find the seeds on those?
Yes, the seed always follows the flower, because the seed is the direct result of the flower maturing and going past. Same with fruit. Fruit always follows the flower. So yeah, with a lettuce, you're going to start out with a little head of lettuce, and then if you let it continue to flower, maybe you already have, you wind up with a plant that's about this tall, sends up a huge flower stalk, has little yellow flowers. It's in the I want to say Compositaceae family, but it's now the Umbelliferate, no, Asteraceae family. Taxonomy is really complicated. They keep changing it. So it's in the Asteraceae family, which used to be called the Compositaceae family, which is like sunflowers, dandelion. Yeah, but you'll see the flower. It looks like a little dandelion. So you can see the relatedness of it. Yeah. Thanks for getting me back on track. Yeah. Thanks for asking awesome questions too. Thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate it.